Yeah, so we're really excited to present this project. It is sort of a ZNCC homegrown research project here that we conceived of last spring when we first started the case studies initiative, actually. And Susan Kidd, who was with Agnes Scott at the time, was like, we're a campus. I don't know if we have a great building case study to contribute, but we have a whole campus worth of data and we report all of our greenhouse gas emissions and we have all of these historic buildings that are listed. Like, how can we make that into a case study? So we did that. We made it into a campus case study instead of a building case study. And we used the CARE tool, which is also, a ZNCC product. And we've just started to publicize the findings this summer, and we're really excited to share them with you all. I'm gonna share my screen. Yeah, I think that's right. Okay, everyone seeing that? Great. And Elizabeth, you can just tell me to go when you need to. Except I left my mouse downstairs, so I have to, there we go. Okay, yeah, so I'll just describe a little bit about the motivation behind the study. We'll do some overview of Agnes Scott College and the campus and their sustainability approach. We'll go through the study methodology and findings and some of our sort of higher level takeaways. So why this study? This is mostly for the purpose of the recording. I know you all know this stuff, but when we think about the climate action, we know that we have to make reductions to our total greenhouse gas emissions in the very near term, which means that we have to be looking for solutions that pay back quickly. We can't look at the full life cycle of a building. We have to look at immediate actions, and which is why building reuse is so important. We know globally buildings contribute about 40% of our total emissions. 28% of that is operational emissions from running buildings, while 11% or more are the embodied carbon emissions that result from the materials extraction, manufacturing, processing, transportation, and construction of buildings. The operational emissions, mostly from existing buildings. The embodied emissions, mostly from new construction. And so when we reuse our existing buildings, rather than replace them, we reduce both of these wedges of the pie by reducing our operational emissions and avoiding emissions from new construction. And while we're mostly talking about carbon, I just obviously want to point out that there are many other environmental impacts and indicators beyond carbon and greenhouse gas emissions. For example, raw material use is responsible for 90% of global biodiversity loss. And here in the United States, 75% of our raw materials go towards construction. So again, a huge opportunity to reuse what we already have and improve our circularity of our construction industry to reduce our impact on the environment. So I kind of already gave this, this background, but when Susan and I first spoke about this, we arrived at this question: how can college campuses leverage their extensive portfolios of buildings, and secondly, their all of the information and data they have about portfolio level energy use, carbon emissions, as well as their pretty ambitious climate commitments to advocate for building stewardship as climate action. And that was the genesis of this study. So this was our project team here. I'm here and Elizabeth are here today. Susan is in Scotland, I think, right now, enjoying retirement. Jean is in London also. Yeah, so half of our contingency is on vacation in the UK right now. Good for them. And Caroline is a student at RISD. I'm going to pass off to Elizabeth to tell you a little bit about Agnes Scott College.
Awesome, thank you, Laurie. So my name is Elizabeth Rowe. I came into this project about a year ago. I was working as a consultant with Susan Kidd in the sustainability office. I'm an alum of Agnes Scott, and I also used to work in the sustainability office for several years, and had come back as a consultant. And then from January to July, when we were doing the bulk of our wrap up, I was working as the interim executive director. And I do just want to say we have a new executive director, Kimberly Reeves, who's on the call as well, who's well versed in sustainability at Agnes Scott. So all three of us have kind of gotten to touch this project. So I want to give you a little context of the campus, where we are, who our students are. But my other big hope is to provide a bit more of the story behind why Agnes Scott's built campus looks the way it does, and why our campus landscape has been preserved in such a way. We, in this report, really talked about this like stewardship ethic, this, commitment to preservation. And it sounds like when we were writing it up, like this was always very intentional and that there's almost like a protocol to follow. But that's not necessarily the case. And I almost, as we were coming up with the right language, like there's a magic to Agnes Scott. I feel that really the buildings there kind of demand that they remain as they are. So just want to provide some of that color, and then also talk through our sustainability goals, because at present, that's really kind of what's driving some of this stewardship in this decade and moving forward. But just very briefly, so we are a historic women's college. We were founded in 1889. We're located in Decatur, Georgia, which today puts us within the metro Atlanta region. So while very dense urban population, the campus itself actually sits in a residential neighborhood and definitely has this kind of tucked away feel. We have just over 1,000 students. We sit on just around 100 acres. We've been named the most innovative liberal arts college 4 years in a row. We credit that one to a campus-wide curriculum, but in sustainability, we also take some credit for that. We are one of the most outward-facing programs at the institution. And we were one of the original signatories of the renamed President's Climate Commitment. So we have been a part of the higher education cohort with ambitious climate goals since the beginning of that group in 2007. So next slide. So Agnes Scott has gone through a few names over the years, but we are now Agnes Scott College and have been for over a century. The campus itself is made up of about 27 buildings. They are from a range of architectural styles. If we got to do this in person and we got to show you off on the campus, Susan Kidd would give you this very grand architectural history tour of Agnes Scott and highlight that we have these like building corridors that you get to have this great architectural transformation. But alas, we are virtual, so we can't do that. But there is, what I will say about our buildings are that let me see. So for our students, and I say this also as an alum, there is absolutely a sense of connection and connectivity to the place of Agnes Scott. And we have a lot of college traditions. Women's colleges are known for that. And they really are big grounded in different buildings. And we talk, and it's typical of college campuses, but talk about buildings as if they are people that we went to college with. Like they have their own personalities, their own stories, their own histories. They house so much of our traditions on campus. And as a small institution that provides a lot of connectivity across classes, I'll just give an example of why this really matters for us as alums. Susan Kidd is also an alum, and we were doing a tour of a building that was being renovated at the time, and I wanted to see my dorm room that I have lived in for 2 years. And so we walk in and Susan goes, "I used to live here." And I was like, "You do not know. Like my boss lives in the same place that I used to live." And it was such a kind of important, like just lovely alum moment, but the college is just full of those stories. And to me, it's those stories that really begin to stitch together why the college has maintained the campus the way that it has. So we could go to the next slide. So our original building on campus, Main Hall, was built in 1891. As you can see, we had multiple kind of construction booms on campus to accommodate growth, which we'll show in more detail on a later slide. And then, parallel to that also started this history or this kind of legacy of renovations. And what's very unique for a college in this day and age is that we have not built a new building since 2008. And the building that we did build was quite small. It was a chapel. The last major new construction was done in the early 2000s. And in the last 10 years, we've started another pretty robust renovation phase on campus. It corresponds with some strategic changes at Agnes Scott to increase growth. So we have a new campus-wide curriculum that intends to kind of build out our student body to capacity of our built environment. And that required some strategic changes to the operations of our buildings. And so we are about to start the phase 3 of the final of these kind of 3 renovations. But we have done, yes, so within 10 years, we will have accomplished 3 major renovations. Each one of these are 100% donor funded. The college isn't taking on any debt or isn't fronting any of the cost of these renovations. They're ranging in cost from $18 to $30 million each, with a large share of that coming from our alumni base. And so these traditions and connectivity to buildings really matter as a fundraising tool as well. And all 3 of these projects, the first started in 2014, correspond with some very major accomplishments for our sustainability program too. And so I think it's a great example of how we have this kind of commitment to preservation on campus, of using space strategically, both for budgetary reasons, but also to ensure this kind of historic legacy of our buildings. But now we get to add in sustainability as a third reason for doing that work. So you can go to the next slide. So this just gives you kind of and shows you in different ways this kind of campus growth, but you can see on the bottom, this change in student enrollment to kind of correspond with this change in campus square footage. So I'll briefly give a little background on sustainability. So we started our program in 2007, and we set a pretty ambitious carbon neutrality goal of 2037. So this marks 15 years in, 15 years to go. The Center for Sustainability is where we do this climate action work. And we really have 2 goals that are actually, we're very much kind of thinking these through and refining these right now. But the first is to achieve carbon neutrality. That's our principal goal. But the second is to become a national thought leader on the topic of women and climate justice. This has definitely been something that's become a priority in the last few years. It's really being driven by our students. And our hope in the future is that, we are kind of a place where folks can go to explore this specific topic. As it relates to carbon neutrality, all of the programs that we run through the center have the goal of helping push us further towards our carbon neutrality date. So very much all within this kind of climate action framework. So whether that's our lead building policy, which is not just to build or renovate sustainable buildings, but it's also to ensure that we're minimizing our carbon footprint. Even our campus-wide waste diversion and construction diversion relates back to that carbon footprint. So we really try and keep everything grounded in climate change and climate action. So our program is 15 years old, so we are proud to report some very impressive accomplishments to date. So we are on track to reduce our scope 1 and 2 emissions by 50% by the end of this calendar year. We pioneered the use of a donor-funded green revolving fund. Kimberly and I can really nerd out on this, so happy to kind of answer questions later, or we provide materials back to folks, but this is a financing mechanism that we use on campus. And what makes it very unique for Agnes Scott is that it is donor funded. So again, pulling into our donor base. And we have funded almost all of our energy reductions that have achieved that 50% goal through the Green Revolving Fund. Any other reductions really are coming from behavioral change. So this is the tool that we use to finance both efficiency, the start of renewable energy, and also deferred maintenance. And then the last kind of progress point to point out is that last year we hosted a conference on campus on women and climate justice. We brought together climate leaders from around the world as kind of to gather and to have conversations, and are beginning to kind of integrate those conversations into the next 15 years of thinking about how do we achieve carbon neutrality while also ensuring that we're doing this work well, and we're doing it well both for our campus community and the greater community in Decatur and Metro Atlanta. Do you want me to take this one, Lauren?
Oh, did you want me to take it? Sure.
Okay. So I spoke briefly about these kind of 3 renovation projects we've accomplished or are in the process of accomplishing. So in the study, we highlighted one of those. This is Rebecca Scott Hall. This building was built in 1905. It's the 2nd oldest building on campus. And it went through a major renovation, its 3rd major renovation in 2018. We are proud to report that this is a LEED Platinum building. It has the highest sustainability rating on campus, especially for a historic building. This building highlights a few unique features at Agnes Scott. So we only have 27 buildings on campus, and we are very creative in how we use those spaces. And so that usually means that almost all of our buildings are mixed use. And so in this case, this is a building that has both administrative offices and residence halls. So it's very typical to live right above people's offices at Agnes Scott. So this is our welcome center. It houses our admissions office, and it also is a residence hall on the 2nd and 3rd floor. When at the point of renovation in 2018, Rebecca Hall was not air conditioned, and it was everyone's intention that we would bring air conditioning to this building. Since we are in the Piedmont region of Georgia, it's a necessity. And from the sustainability side, while we absolutely support bringing in the HVAC system, we did want to make sure that we were putting in the most efficient system that we could so that we would minimize the impact to our carbon emissions. And so we installed our 2nd geothermal HVAC system for the building. It runs the HVAC and the hot water. We removed a surface parking lot to install this system, and actually made the local news because it's in a very urban area. You don't normally see parking lots being ripped out and green space going in. We also did all the updates to low flow water fixtures, LED lights, and that former parking lot, now geothermal field, is a green space.
All right, thanks, Elizabeth. So now that you have a sense of the campus and the sort of context of the study, I'll walk you through the methodology. So we approached this with the hypothesis that this really strongly, deeply embedded ethic of stewardship would result in measurable carbon emissions reductions in support of the institution's climate neutrality target. So we, I thought I updated it. It still says to build or not to build calculator here. You all know that means care tool. This meant compiling all this information about the history of the campus, the iteration, those building booms, as well as the renovation booms and sort of the life history of each of the buildings. We went through all of the utility and greenhouse gas data to as best as possible compile a picture of historical energy use. And then we ran it through the care tool. And those two, I will say that the data was kind of a luxury because Agnes got tracked so well. So, we were thinking the entire time we were doing the study about replicability and how this could be applied at other campuses, but also at other portfolio scales for private building owners or even municipalities. But what we did use were the dates of construction and the dates of renovation, the building sizes, obviously, systems types, whatever we could find out about those renovations and the scale of them, as well as that historical utility data. And then we used the care tool to analyze each of the buildings. I think everyone here is familiar with the tool, but essentially it is a high-level estimator that compares three scenarios. What happens if you do nothing to an existing building? What happens if you reuse it and upgrade its performance? And what happens if you replace it with new construction? And then you compare the total carbon emissions results of those three scenarios across each other. And so what we did for this study was manually create a portfolio version of the tool so that we could run all of the buildings against each other. And this was pretty exciting because it was both expanding it to look at multiple buildings against each other, but also to look at each building over time. So looking at from original construction projected out to that carbon neutrality date of 2037, looking at the cumulative impact of renovating multiple times over a building's history. So obviously there were a number of assumptions made with the data. We assumed that all embodied carbon emissions happen at that point of construction or point of renovation, when in reality they're a little bit distributed. We did use the energy use data when available. When not available, we used CBEC's averages and eGrid for emissions. So we did have to infill with some assumptions. And then additionally, we had a lot of history of the buildings, so in terms of when they were renovated, but when we didn't have the exact details of that, we had to assume a typical renewal cycle. So we said that for a higher education institution, buildings will be renovated substantially, roughly every 40 to 50 years. And that was our assumption for historically and to project out renewals. And our major findings were validated the hypothesis, I would say. We looked at two timeframes. One was retrospective, so from the founding of the campus through the present time, and then the second projecting out to the year 2037, that carbon neutrality target date. And when we looked back historically, this chart shows you the embodied carbon emissions only of two scenarios. The green is the stewardship approach to growth that the campus took. So you can see embodied carbon is added as new construction happens or as renovations happen. And then the red line is an alternative approach in which, rather than renovate buildings, the college tore them down and replaced them at those points of renewal. And looking back over the 100-year history roughly of the campus, this approach avoided about 34,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide. And to put that in the scale of the campus, a forest planted on the entire 100-acre campus of Agnes Scott would have to grow over 400 years to sequester the amount of carbon dioxide. So that was pretty interesting to understand the scale of avoided carbon emissions of reuse over this portfolio. And then we can also look at those buildings over time, combining the embodied and operational emissions. So this is just to look at one building to orient ourselves. This is Rebecca Hall, that case study that Elizabeth talked through. And this is starting in 1950, the first time the building was renovated, and looking through 2037, essentially. You can see three lines. The gray line is if you didn't renovate the building that entire time, which isn't really plausible. The green line is renovation. So this is what actually happened. The building was renovated 3 times over this time frame. And then the red line is the hypothetical, what if you had instead replaced the building at each of those points? And you can essentially see how the renovation approach results in lower total cumulative carbon, basically over this entire time frame. And in fact, after that second renewal point, the carbon payback, the renovation, pays itself back from a carbon perspective, meaning that through improved operational efficiency, you've offset the embodied carbon of all of the renovations over the building's history. as opposed to the red line, the replacement building. This is saying that even if we replace the building this last time with basically net zero construction, it's still not going to pay back compared to renovating the building during this time frame. And in fact, it's only better than doing nothing to the building after the third renovation. We can take the same approach and look at it across the entire portfolio, but this was, I think, our first interesting finding was that when you layer all of that data together, it's really hard to discern the difference between those scenarios. And this was, I think, a pretty interesting statement about just the relative proportion of operational emissions compared to embodied emissions when you're looking at a portfolio of this scale of old buildings that aren't typically very efficient. So you can kind of see every time you renovate or replace a building and improve the efficiency of that single building, it makes a little wave in the total emissions, but it's not making the same big difference as you can see at the single building scale. So we looked at it differently, and this is my grid of charts. Essentially, this is rather than looking at cumulative emissions, looking at annual emissions. So every year, how much greenhouse gas is being emitted into the atmosphere from the buildings on campus. The top row are those embodied emissions from materials, and the bottom row are operational emissions from the energy being used within the buildings. So if we say that baseline cases, we don't do anything to any of the buildings, obviously there's no embodied carbon, and the operational carbon remains static because you're not changing the efficiency of the buildings. The red is if you replace those buildings with the renewal cycle. And essentially here you can see that every time you replace a building, there's a spike in embodied carbon relative to the size of the building. And some years, if you're replacing multiple buildings, there's a bigger spike. And then below it, the operational emissions, you can see associated with each of those spikes of embodied carbon, there's a little bit of a step down in operational carbon because those buildings are more efficient. And then the green is that renovation option where you can see the embodied carbon spikes are much lower, and you can essentially achieve the same reduction in operational emissions, that same downward curve, which has been proved out through the renovations that are taking place on campus now. And when we combine these together and look at the total annual emissions, so this is embodied plus operational, you can really start to see how they trend down, that light green and the dark red that we saw before, and you can see those spikes. And the relative proportion of the embodied carbon spikes relative to the operational carbon really shows you that it does make a difference in the total, the total emissions of the campus. But the line that really, what we found was the most successful approach here is that darker green line. And this line says we don't have to wait 40 or 50 years to upgrade a building. We should upgrade them all now. So this is the both and scenario in which you both retrofit existing buildings as the campus has been doing, continuing to make those both behavioral changes and efficiency changes across the entire portfolio. And also as buildings reach that renewal point, you renovate them to a high level of efficiency rather than replace them. And that scenario really results in huge carbon reductions. This is looking between 2007, when the carbon neutrality target was established, to 2037, the date of that carbon neutrality. We're going to assume that you can replace all of the buildings and buy energy offsets or renewables to get to net zero. You can renovate the buildings at the end of their life and offset to net zero. Or you can do that third line that really actually gets you closer to net zero, truly, and then offset less. And the difference in emissions is huge. It's 41% difference or 38% between just replacing buildings and taking this stewardship approach, which is equivalent to 115,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide, which is over 1,000 years of that same forest growing the size of the campus. So this, I think this was a really important finding for the campus in terms of really starting to put a carbon value, an environmental value on the stewardship strategies that they were already taking because of that, sense of magic and identity in place. And we also studied the co-benefits. I think that's, one thing that we talk about often in this group is that carbon, zero net carbon is important, but also reuse buildings because of all these other co-benefits. And Elizabeth is going to describe a few of those in relationship to the campus.
Yeah, so we looked at a series of co-benefits. I just pulled out two to share and also to kind of speak to some of the wider kind of portfolio of programs that the Center for Sustainability runs. We are also in, liberal arts college, very interdisciplinary. And so we often think in this kind of co-benefit framework. So the first to talk through is the college, in addition to having a carbon neutrality goal, we also, through our President's Climate Commitment, have a commitment to community resilience. And so we created jointly with our local municipality, the city of Decatur, a joint climate resilience plan. We run this plan directly in partnership with the city of Decatur through a joint task force. And what this is enabling us to do is to really leverage resources that would have been out of reach for either party on our own, and really beginning to think about how do we use our, for this example, our building stock in partnership with each other, and how do we leverage our unique assets so that we are kind of jointly achieving resilience for our community. So one of the goals for this fall is that between Agnes Scott and the city of Decatur, there's going to be roughly 450 kilowatts of solar installed, both on Agnes Scott's parking deck and then the city of Decatur at their Public Works and Recreation Center. And this is enabling us to have some very interesting conversations on emergency shelters and what do we do during, in this case, periods of extreme heat, and what resources do we have at Agnes Scott during those events versus what the city has. And so I bring this up, one, just because the city solar arrays are going to come with battery storage. And so that's really shifted our conversation from thinking about previously the focus was, well, Agnes Scott students are away in the summer, so our buildings are the best bet for cooling centers during extreme heat events, to thinking about leveraging this kind of capacity for the city of Decatur. But this plan and doing it in partnership is really allowing us to kind of maximize the resources that each of us have for our community. So next slide. So the other co-benefit to highlight here is our campus landscape. So I think if our buildings demand to be preserved as they are, the campus landscape does in equal measure. So we have a campus-wide arboretum that was actually started as a student project by Kimberly Reeves, our new director. I always have to bring that up. So we have about 54% canopy coverage, over 2,000 trees. We are a level 2 registered arboretum. We've been a designated tree campus for over a decade, and now are a bee campus, which represents a commitment to pollinator health through our landscaping. But this sense of place is derived just as much from how we think about maintaining and preserving this landscape. That doesn't mean that it can't adapt and evolve. Our buildings adapt and evolve. I remain shocked. There used to be a road straight through Agnes Scott's campus, Buttrick Drive. It still has a street name, but now is a pedestrian walkway. But these kind of non-carbon dominant benefits are just as important to kind of telling the whole story of sustainability at Agnes Scott. So do you want me to do this, Lori?
I can do the conclusions.
Okay.
So we pulled a few conclusions, I think, separate from those numerical findings from the study, that some of which were a little bit surprising or reinforcing to us. The first is really that there are many paths to carbon neutrality. We often talk about climate goals in terms of carbon neutrality, but that's not really the ultimate end goal. The ultimate end goal is to prevent global warming by limiting the greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. And so to do that, there are many trajectories we can take. And this reusing existing buildings at the end of their life and improving their performance as soon as we have the chance to is really the fastest way to reduce those emissions and to minimize our carbon budget. The next is that we found that chart showed you that you have to reinvest both at renewal points and implement more continuous energy retrofits. It can't be one or the other. We have to really think of stewardship as a continuum. And I think that aligns pretty directly with preservation principles that we have. You can't just let the deferred maintenance pile up. We have to be good stewards of these buildings. The third is that new construction typically never yields near-term carbon reductions. We found that, we've seen that at the single building scale, and we can see it at the portfolio scale. It just does not pay back by 2030, by 2050, and maybe longer. And then lastly, that those co-benefits are really important, and Elizabeth just touched on too, but there were a lot related to, local economy and salvage and circular economy opportunities, educational opportunities, both with the students, but also with the local community about historic buildings, about renewable energy and how those go together, and many others as well. So that's it. We're happy to answer any questions anyone has.